I'm Sarah Bogue. I work at the Candler School of Theology at Emory. I am ordained to that work from the Greater Atlanta Presbytery in a validated ministry position, which is awesome. I am from Atlanta. I went to Lovett. Yes, with many of you or people that are related to you, and Davidson College, and then Princeton Seminary. And this particular series is the second one I've done at Trinity. Last year at this time, I was doing medievalism and white supremacy, so ways in which medieval origin stories are used to support ethnic Christian nationalism in the United States, which was controversial. We had a lot of fun. I had fun. I don't know if everyone had fun. And this one is more on focusing on questions I got a lot at that time, which was about the women in these same time periods. So we started last week with Perpetua and Felicitas, who are some of our early church martyrs. Anyone in here remember anything about Perpetua and Felicitas from last week? Gory, okay, yes, gory. Gender-specific gory, though, right?
They were mothers.
They were both mothers, yes. They were African, North Africa, absolutely. This is good. Yes, they were sent into the arena as part of their martyrdom into a gladiatorial arena. And Perpetua and Thecla were met with female animals, which was an interesting thread that we'll pick up on today. But yeah, they were mothers. Their children were miraculously weaned, so their children could survive even though, and Felicitas gave birth while in jail. And the guard had the audacity to say, "Oh, you're being very loud while you're giving birth. How are you going to handle the arena?" She's like, "Listen, you haven't seen anything yet," and proceeds to go to the arena and be martyred. The interesting thing about the Perpetua narrative, too, is that the vast majority of it was supposed to be written by Perpetua herself. So it's this weird genre where it's appended and appendixed by a third party who describes and contextualizes the role of Perpetua in what might have been a pro-Montanist narrative. So these early Christian groups that were deemed heretical because they were very fond of visionary experiences, ecstatic preaching, and the people who were doing those things were mostly women. So it comes as no surprise that that was deemed heretical by the 2nd and 3rd century church fathers. And Thecla, unfortunately, falls in a similar boat. The Acts of Paul and Thecla, I think, would have made the Gospels and that sort of the New Testament narrative a little bit more interesting, in my opinion. Gives you a different side of Paul, I will tell you that. Is anybody here a Paul fan? Yeah. You're a Paul fan? Okay. You're not. You're an on the Paul fan. All right. Well, this will give you a different perspective on Paul. Women in the New Testament. Can we name any women in the New Testament? Lydia. Mary Magdalene. Mary. We got all the big hitters here. Okay. Martha. And would you characterize the work that those women did as contributing to the evangelizing mission of the early church, such as Paul was doing? Were they preachers and teachers? Not that we know of. Does that mean there were no women preachers and teachers in the New Testament, time periods, or in texts around the New Testament? No, doesn't mean that. The record that we have is constructed, both historically and theologically. So there's a reason that Thecla doesn't make its way into the canon. What is the biblical canon? This is not a trick question. It was what was voted on, right? So prior to the institutionalization of the canon as a specific set of books that are accepted as a part of the church's tradition, there were lots of early church texts roaming around. Paul wrote a lot of letters. That guy would not shut up. A lot of letters, right? But there are also other stories that are circulating around this time period that include people that don't make their way into the canon proper. So what's the difference between the words apocrypha with a big A, I am in front of this, or apocryphal, which is an adjective?
Well, apocrypha is what those other works are.
Okay, yeah.
And is apocryphal meaning kind of end time stuff?
Though that's apocalyptic, this is a fun adjective lesson day. So yeah, apocrypha is the formal subsection of certain biblical texts that certain Christian traditions adhere to. So things like Esdras, Tobit, Wisdom, Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, Maccabees. These are not in many of our Reformed traditions' Bibles, but they were a part of other non-Reformed Catholic traditions. And it is still a canon in and of itself, right? There's a certain set of books that are included in this formal big A apocrypha. Apocryphal is an adjective that some of us might use to describe stories told in our family that are a little far-fetched, right? It has a negative connotation. That's to say, this is a story that isn't very realistic, probably wasn't true. And what's interesting about the Acts of Paul and Thecla, that's the text we'll be talking about today, it kind of has a foot in both camps. It is not in the formal Apocrypha, and once you hear what's in it, I think that will make sense to you. But it is so widely circulated as a medieval and late antique text. We know that it was essential to how the early church constructed its own identity. So we're going to talk a little bit about who Thecla was, who wrote this text, but to give you a sense for where it was situated, it should not surprise you if you know about the work of Paul, that this text is situated in Asia Minor. So in places where Paul visited, it has two particular sections. Thecla will go through a number of different movements herself. She has an itinerant component to her work, the way that Paul does. And unfortunately for her, both of the main cities where she experiences almost martyrdom, and this is going to be important, she is not martyred. Thecla is not martyred, but she does have two arena experiences wherein she is divinely saved through intervention from the heavenly hosts in a variety of really interesting ways. So the Acts of Paul and Thecla is devoted exclusively to the travels of Thecla and Paul. And unfortunately, we don't get to Thecla until chapter 5 of the text, which is interesting. But both of them move throughout Asia Minor, interacting with a lot of Roman elites in this time period. It was written sometime in the 2nd or 3rd century, and the chronological scope of this text begins with Paul coming to visit the town where Thecla lives, and ends with Thecla's pseudo-death. So what's really interesting is she doesn't actually die, which is a sharp contrast to Perpetua and Felicitas, where the death was very gory, and that was kind of the whole point of the narrative. Thecla sort of just fades away, which imbues the location where she faded away with some particular significance, theologically, spiritually. Her location becomes, where this happened, becomes a site for pilgrimage. And there's a whole second set of Thecla narratives that are situated specifically on this death site as a site for future miracles. So Thecla's story comes in a variety of different forms, and we don't actually know who wrote this text. There is no named author. It is not written by Thecla herself, so unlike Perpetua, this is not a narrative written by her. But we know that this story may represent a larger group of women at this time period who were itinerant preachers. So the question becomes, we have this text, we have many, many copies of this text. How possible is it that there were communities of women at this time doing Paul-like service, wandering around and preaching? This text becomes super, super popular, and it's entirely possible that it is representative of a tradition that, like the Montanists, is deemed heretical when the church starts to institutionalize in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And as part of that institution, we take certain letters of Paul, which do not allow for the leadership of women, to be core and canon as a part of who the church becomes. I just want to point out, this text, prior to that, suggests another narrative. So when did they write this? Like I said, 2nd and 3rd century, and we happen to know precisely when this was written because one of our early church fathers has a very violent reaction to the text. Tertullian, who is also from North Africa, writes a text called De Baptismo, so it's about baptism, and as part of this text, he has a bone to pick with Thecla. And the reason he has a bone to pick with Thecla is because Thecla baptizes herself in the arena. So as part of the animals that are sent against her, there's a pit of rabid seals. Yes, seals. that are in a pool, and she is thrown into the pool. And as she is being thrown into the pool, she baptizes herself. This is problematic for a lot of reasons, right? Even contemporary Presbyterians are not really pro jumping into a pool and baptizing yourself, right? You guys were baptized by somebody in authority, right? Okay. Well, Tertullian has lots of problems with this, and it's interesting to kind of figure out, is it the gender that he has problems with? Or, yes, okay, yes, Velma says yes. It's not just the gender, though. It's also the sacrament happening outside of the hierarchy of the church. It's a problem that she's a woman doing this, but it's also problematic. We don't want everybody running around and baptizing themselves, because if that's the case, we don't need the church. Right? So Tertullian says, if certain acts of Paul, which are falsely so named, claim the example of Thecla for allowing women to teach and baptize, let men know that in Asia the presbyter who compiled that document, thinking to add of his own accord to Paul's reputation, was found out, and though he professed he had done it for love of Paul, was deposed from his position. How could we believe that Paul should give a female power to teach and to baptize when he did not allow a woman even to learn by her own right? Let them keep silence, he says, and ask their husbands at home. That's Paul. Tertullian's not wrong. This is Paul. What's important to know about when Tertullian is writing, which is in the 3rd century, is that there's still some ambiguity about who and what Paul is. We haven't decided on the core New Testament texts, the letters of Paul to the Philippians, to the Ephesians. We haven't decided as those being the only ones that represent Paul, or even that Paul is representative of an authority in the early church exclusive to other authorities. But Tertullian feels very strongly about this. He says the texts that we have that are the letters to and from nascent church communities, these are Paul and these are canon. This story, he suggests, is made up by somebody who's trying to fluff up Paul's reputation, and it is inconsistent in Tertullian's mind with the authentic Paul. So what I want you to hear here is already competing narratives about what is authority and what women have access to in that authority of the church. And it's interesting here, too, he names Thecla as both a teacher and a baptizer, even though she doesn't baptize anybody but herself. Why does she baptize herself? Because Paul won't do it. Which is interesting. Is this the only thing we have about Thecla in the early church? Actually not. We have lots and lots of different acts of Paul that kind of roam around various portions of Asia Minor, and not all of these made their way into the New Testament canon. We also have the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which is a particular narrative that happened sometime prior to Tertullian freaking out in the 3rd century. We also have some manuscripts of the Acts of Paul and Thecla that add on sort of as appendices other activities of Paul. Again, it is entirely possible that the Acts of Paul and Thecla is the result of an oral tradition that is happening at this time, that is perhaps the result of women's communities that are moving around Asia Minor and doing the preaching and teaching just like Paul is, but without the authorization of the church proper. And we don't know for sure that this is the case, but I will say it seems like the kind of thing the early church would not have wanted to support and would be invested in not archiving some of these stories. So we have the Acts of Paul and Thecla in the 2nd and 3rd century. We also have another text, series of texts that are from church fathers that are contemporaneous to this story happening. So Tertullian, famous church father, also famous for being kind of grumpy about a lot of things, is not a fan of Thecla. But we also have the works of Gregory of Nyssa. We have the works of John Chrysostom. All of these are famous church fathers of the 3rd and 4th centuries who were huge Thecla fans. They speak highly of her and they commend her to women in their communities as an example of what women should aspire to be. They don't have any compunction about calling her a teacher or a preacher. They don't really talk about the baptizing thing because I think everyone finds that problematic. But we also have this amazing story in the 4th century of a nun named Egeria, who is from Spain, who travels all the way from Spain to go to Asia Minor and visit the site where Thecla died. So we know by the 4th century, remember the story was just written in the 2nd or 3rd century, a mere 100 years later, her shrine, the site where she sort of is absorbed into the wall, which we'll read in a second, love it, becomes a significant site for pilgrimage specifically for women. Egeria goes all the way from Spain to Asia Minor. Could go back to that map. That's a very long, multi-year pilgrimage. And she also has a great story about there needing to be guards at the sites of these particular relics because people would come and kiss them and then take bites of the relic as a way of stealing them. It's delightful. Crosses, not like actual bones and such, to be clear. Like pieces of the true cross. No one's biting bones, sorry. But it's a great way of showing us that the culture around saints' lives was still developing and significant to the way the church understood itself. Chrysostom, Gregory of Nyssa, Egeria, all famous early church folks are pro-Thecla. And we have to put that in conversation with Tertullian being not a big fan. Our last source that's the most fun is called The Life and Miracles of Thecla. We just kind of bump Paul out of the story in its entirety. Love that. And it's focused on miracles that happen at the site of her death. It includes a much shorter paraphrased version of her life, but is mostly just sort of episodes of miracles that happen. And those miracles are a way of situating Christianity in this region as a new authority, a new power over and above Greco-Roman institutions and understandings of power. For example, we have a story where Thecla makes war against a nearby peak, which had come to be known as Athena's temple. This mountain was taken away from the demon. Now Athena's a demon. I don't know that I follow that. But taken away from the demon and placed under the rulership of Christ, exactly as it was from the beginning. So we start to see Thecla as a symbol of Christianity digging down roots in these regions. It's not Paul who's going out and conquering Greco-Roman deities. It's Thecla, which is awesome. Okay. The two different death accounts from the Acts of Paul and Thecla and then the life and miracles of Thecla sort of give you a sense of the tone of each of these texts. So the Acts of Paul and Thecla just said, having testified, she went to Seleucia and enlightened many by the word of God. So there's just one line, she's going and preaching, and then she rested in glorious sleep, period. Nothing else. Okay? The life and miracle says, did she die? Absolutely not. Just as the most widespread and more sure tradition attests, she sunk down while alive and went under the earth, which is awesome. It separated for her and became a cleft from below on the very spot where is fixed the divine and holy liturgical table. This is where she dispenses fountains of healing for every suffering and every sickness, pouring out healings there as if from some rushing stream upon those who ask and pray for them. So the spidey senses might be tingling, and you're like, this sounds a lot like an advertisement to come get some healing at the site where she died, right? Yes, it does sound like, and we talked about the way in which pilgrimage, saints' lives, saints' cults have an economic component to them. If you bring people to your site, they will spend money where you are, right? And yet, what does the value of her not dying? We just read Perpetua and Felicitas last week where their deaths were the core of the narrative. What do you make of this non-death now being the core of a narrative? Okay, exactly. In many ways, this is a more impressive thing because she didn't have to die, especially after I'm going to show you she narrowly avoids death in the arena multiple times. It's an ultimate conquering of Christian life over death, right? And it's the site where this happened, they actually situate the altar on top of it. And that's a really common thing in the early church to have relics or types of connections to saints be put in the altar, which is now the center of the worshiping community. And the reason for that is this is where time and space get collapsed. You have access to the divine in a unique proximity that you don't have anywhere else in the world, which is why people come and visit it, right? It makes the sacred space sacred. And the saints are at the core of that. Saints like Thecla, despite what Paul does to her story. Okay.
Where is it?
Seleucia in Asia Minor. Yep, it's,
There's a town.
yep, it is this one right here. Yep. It's a yellow one. So, what is the Acts of Paul and Therida narrative arc? First starts when Paul arrives to hang out with some Christians in Thecla's town. Because of this, Thecla decides that she is not going to marry the man she is intended to marry. Her mom and her fiance find this unacceptable, and they get Paul arrested as a result of this. Both Paul and Thecla are brought before the governor, and only Thecla somehow is sentenced to death in the arena. She is miraculously saved from this bonfire, and both of them, Paul and Thecla, carry on to do some more missionary work. However, the very next town that they go to, Thecla is again encountered by a nobleman who wants to marry her. She rejects him very dramatically, unfortunately for him. He is deeply offended, and he has her imprisoned again. She goes into the arena again. And this is the arena where she fights a lioness, right? It's not just any regular lion, it's a lioness. This is the arena where she baptizes herself. It's in Iconium where she is supported by a group of women who come and support her in the arena and who house her while she's supposed to be in prison. They entrust her to this local noblewoman, Theoclea, who sees her as a new type of daughter for her. And it's a testament to this women's community in Iconium that they come and support her. The wails of the women are heard when she's in the arena. She miraculously escapes this arena and goes on to preach and teach without Paul's blessing. So let's look at some of the pieces of this narrative. What is Paul saying when he comes to her town? Well, it's typical Paul stuff. Blessed are the bodies of the virgins, for they shall be well-pleasing to God and shall not lose the reward of their chastity. For the word of the Father shall become to them a work of salvation in the day of the Son, and they shall have rest forever and ever. Sexual purity, that's what Paul's talking about. And Thecla finds this fascinating. The story is Paul's doing his preaching in the house next to hers, and so she just gets to the window and apparently doesn't move for 3 days listening to Paul talk. I can't say I would have found Paul that exciting, but she does. And while Paul is speaking over here, the house of Onesiphorus is right next to them. Thecla, the daughter of Theoclea, betrothed to a man named Thamyris, was sitting at the window close by, listening day and night to the discourse of virginity as proclaimed by Paul. And she did not look away from the window, but was led on by faith, rejoicing exceedingly. And when she saw women and virgins going into Paul, she had a desire to be deemed worthy to stand in Paul's presence, for she had not yet seen Paul in person, but only heard his word. And she did not move from the window. As she did not move from the window, her mother sends for her betrothed. So, one of the things you should know about Thecla is that she is a teenager. And this sounds like the kind of thing a teenager would do, right? You get really obsessed with some particular narrative, right? Especially a narrative that gives you agency, potentially, in ways that your original life plan did not. She is clearly supposed to be married. Her mom and dad are invested in her being married. We don't hear anything about her dad, which I also find very interesting. So her mother, sees Thecla clinging like a spider, is the Greek, which I love that. I don't know why. Clinging like a spider to the window for 3 days, just listening to Paul. She hasn't seen him, ever. And so Thecla's mom says, Thecla, why are you hanging out here? This is ridiculous. What sort of feeling holds you distracted? Come back to your betrothed. This is unseemly. Why do you sit thus looking down and answering nothing like a sick woman? And those who were in the house wept bitterly. Thamyris for the loss of a wife, Theoclea for that of a child, and the maidservants for that of a mistress. And there was a great outpouring of lamentation in the house. And Thecla is unmoved. She stays at that window. What I want you to see here is what we saw in Perpetua and Felicitas. There are ramifications for the family system if the daughter does not pursue the life plan as dictated by Greco-Roman social norms, right? If she does not get married, the whole family is going to suffer. For Perpetua, the voice of that reason was her father. For Thecla, it's her mother. And it's the maidservants that are mourning the loss of a mistress. Theoclea is believing she's going to lose her child to this weirdo, Paul, that's preaching about chastity. The core of the Greco-Roman social system is marriage and family. That is why some of the early church teaching are so controversial, because they undermine these building blocks of society. What makes Rome run? Families, relationships between families. And Paul and the early church movement is creating a new familial system that's not genetic or based on marriage. And they're saying you shouldn't have children. You shouldn't do the thing that continues your line. You're pointing to a different way of being. And Theoclea and Thamyris find this really alarming. Thecla, however, big fan. Big fan. Huge fan. And so she and Paul, because of Thecla's betrothed, are brought in front of a local governor, and Paul is sent to prison. Thecla follows Paul to prison. She has gone to see the foreigner in prison, and they went and found her, so to say, chained to him by affection. What do we think of that? She's like a groupie. She's a Paul groupie, and there were a lot of Paul groupies, to be totally honest. And she is following him around, even if it means going to prison. If you were Thecla's mom, how would you feel about that? Not good, right? Not good. What's going on? When Paul is taken back in front of the governor after Thecla has visited him in prison, the governor gladly hears Paul speak about the works of Christ. And so he's like, you know what, we need to hear from Thecla, because the people who are bringing the suit against Paul are Thecla's family members. So he brings Thecla to court and says, why don't you marry Thamyris according to the law of the Iconians? Why aren't you playing by the rules? She stood there looking earnestly at Paul. Right? And when she gave no answer, her mom cries out saying, burn the wicked one. Burn her who will not marry in the midst of the theater, that all the women who have been taught by this man may be afraid. Right? So mom says, well, this isn't working. Why don't we scare her straight and put her in the arena? Right? All the moms are like, I would never do that. That's a little far, right? What do you make of that last line? He will, that all the women who have been taught by this man may be afraid. All the groupies. The danger of the groupies. Oh man, I'm gonna have to write an article calling it "The Danger of Paul's Groupies." Love that.
There's other women that are like Thecla.
Exactly.
That are out there.
Yes, right? And we heard early, maybe preaching, maybe teaching, right? We heard at the very beginning that Thecla is moved by the fact that there are lots of other women that are going in and out of this house next door, right? So Paul's having an effect on the women especially, which does seem antithetical to everything we know about Paul. So Thecla goes into the arena at her mother's request, and a pyre is set up to burn her. The executioners arrange the wood and tell her to go out on the pile, and having made the sign of the cross, she goes up. And they lighted the fire, and though there was a great fire blazing, it doesn't touch her. For God, having compassion upon her, made an underground rumbling, and a cloud full of water and hail overshadowed the theater from above, and all its contents were poured out, so that many were in the danger of death. And the fire was put out, and Thecla was saved. Is anyone like, where is Paul in this? He's just put back in prison and then released. Thecla, however, is being made a symbol. The idea here is to show people what happens if you flout social norms and pursue this Paul dude, you're going to get burned at the stake. Anyone having witchy vibes here? Yeah, right? But she's saved in a deeply miraculous way, right? So miraculous that the saving of Thecla endangers the lives of people around her. The hail hurts other people. It's a very potent response from God. It should, but it doesn't, Velma. It absolutely does not. It does not. It does not, sadly. So all that it does is confirm Thecla's desire to continue doing the work that she has done. And as a result of that, she follows Paul to Antioch. She follows Paul to Antioch, and immediately, they just walk in Antioch, and right away, someone's like, ooh, I want to marry that girl. Soon as they arrived, a certain Syrian named Alexander, who is an influential citizen of Antioch, becomes enamored with her and tries to bribe Paul with gifts and presents. So what's interesting here is that is something you would do for a father figure, asking for the hand of the daughter. So we've got weird kinship relations going on here. Paul said, I don't know the woman who you're talking about, nor is she mine. Kind of cowardly. Alexander, being of great power, says, well, I'm just going to go ahead and embrace Thecla in the street and make her my betrothed. But Thecla would not endure it, and she looked about for Paul. Can't find Paul. She cried out bitterly, saying, do not force the stranger, do not force the servant of God. I have been cast out of Iconium for refusing a marriage already. And taking hold of Alexander, she tears his cloak, pulls off his crown, and makes him a laughingstock. That wasn't a really smart move if you wanted to keep a low profile in Antioch, right? And again, we have this trope of attempting to force Thecla into a marriage that she does not want. Only in this case, it's not her family system that's doing it, it's a stranger. And her new family, Paul, doesn't do anything to stop it. Now, how do you think Alexander responded to this deep, deep, deep shame? He went away and said, Thecla, you're fine. We're just not going to talk again, right? Nope. In fact, he has her brought in front of the governor of Antioch, and he has her, instead of being put in prison, she is taken to the house of Tryphaena, is the name of this local noblewoman. They use the language of like princess, so we're not really sure what that means in Antioch. It's certainly an elite woman. And Tryphaena agrees to house Thecla until she goes into the arena, again, this time in Antioch. And while she's there, we hear from Tryphaena about how Thecla reminds her of her own daughter. And she says, Falconilla, her daughter, appeared to her mom in a dream and said, Mother, receive this stranger, the forsaken Thecla, in my place, that she may pray for me and I may come to the place of the just. What does that mean?
The sacrifice for an exchange.
Exactly. So Falconilla, who is already dead, is appearing to her mother in a dream, saying, if you provide charity to Thecla, that's going to have an impact on my salvation. There's a section in Perpetua and Felicitas where Perpetua's brother appears to her and asks for similar intercession. He is also dead. Remember, this is a part of the early church where we're figuring out the theological mathematics on how does the afterlife work? How does the prayers that we say while we're alive on behalf of the dead, does that have some impact on their ultimate status? We're still working this out, but it's clear that even beyond that intercession component of this prayer, there is a cohort of women here. There's not a single man in this household that's mentioned. We have Tryphaena and Falconilla, who is interceding on behalf of Thecla. And Tryphaena receives her and is aggrieved because on the following day, Thecla is supposed to fight with the wild beasts. She loved Thecla. She loved Falconilla, and she calls Thecla her second child and says, "Come pray for my first child, that she may live in eternity, for this I saw in my sleep." And without hesitation, Thecla prays an intercessory prayer for the dead Falconilla. So it seems like Thecla has started to accrue a little bit more confidence in herself as a practitioner of the Christian faith, enough so that she's willing to intercede on behalf of Tryphonia's dead daughter. And where is Paul? He literally drops out of the narrative at this point. He doesn't defend her against Alexander, doesn't defend her against the governor of Antioch. Instead, we have this group of women interceding on behalf of Thecla, who then intercedes on behalf of them eschatologically. Exciting. Yeah. How are we feeling about this? Everyone's very quiet.
It's just the opposite of what Paul wanted.
Right. And they're working around him, basically. And that only continues, which is delightful. What happens in the arena, and these are some very different depictions of how this looks, is that Thecla is met by lionesses in the arena. And a lioness comes to her feet and then defends her against the other animals in the arena, licking her feet, apparently. This one. Indeed, this person clearly did not understand the assignment. This is a contemporary one. It's all messed up. Mm-hmm.
And they're beautiful, which makes sense with everybody falling in love.
It's true. Mm-hmm. They're at her feet, right? And when that doesn't work, they bring out the pool of seals. Now, the logistics of that, I'm very unclear on. I will tell you that in ancient Rome, there was a possibility for flooding arenas to have mock naval battles, right? Called naumachii. That's why we have all the things underneath the Colosseum to bring animals up and down and to close it all off so you can have. Now, but this doesn't appear to be the entire arena flood. It does seem to be a distinct pool of seals is the word that were used. Oh, and here's a Thecla swag, Thecla merch. This is if you go to Seleucia and you get a little pilgrim's flask that has Thecla on it. Now you know you visited, right? Told you it was an economic enterprise, not lying about that. So she is in the arena. She has tamed the wild beasts. They bring out the seals. They put her on the stand and are about to push her into the seals. Seals have never struck me as particularly violent, but they're very ferocious in this story. And so when she finishes her prayer, she turns around sees this large pit of water and says, "Now it is time to wash myself." And as she throws herself in, she says, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I baptize myself on the last day." Paul, up till this point, has refused to baptize her, let alone authorize her preaching and teaching mission. So she takes it upon herself. And she does it in a really public place. Remember, this is a huge arena filled with Antiochene people, including tons and tons of women who have come to support her, including Tryphonia and her sort of cohort of women. What kind of statement is this, would you say? Triumphant, yes?
I don't need you, Paul.
I don't need you, Paul. I got this figured out. I don't need you, Paul, right? And much like the scene in the arena in Iconium where the fire is put out, the miracles are undergirding this liturgical act, right? She's been divinely approved to do this in a way, right? God protects her from the lions. God protects her, or will be about to protect her from the seals. It's a lightning bolt that then kills the seals. Awesome. I don't know why this isn't in the New Testament. It'd be great. A lot more people would read it. Right? So it's this combination of the miraculous as sort of a divine approval of Thecla's activities and the authority she takes on in herself. There's no ambiguity here. In the name of Christ, I baptize myself. We can't be like, oh, maybe she was just, mumbling. She's baptizing herself. Very, very threatening, right? So Paul comes back after the arena, very conveniently after the arena has happened, because Tryphaena takes Thecla back in, right? And Paul is like, oh, now I want to hear kind of, how did that go? What's going on? Been so long, missed you, right? And Thecla's like, I don't really love this. And says, I'm going to go to Iconium, right? And Paul finally says, go and teach the word of God. This is chapter 41 of a 60-chapter narrative. This is the first time Paul authorizes her mission. And apparently Tryphaena sends her away with clothing and gold so she can leave many things for Paul for the service of the poor. So Tryphaena is still going to fund Paul's mission, still. It's a really interesting story. What are your main takeaways from that narrative? This is Theoclea, by the way, over there.
Anybody?
We had to have some takeaways. Yes! Excellent. My work here is done.
Paul was a schmuck.
Yes. What does it say about the authority of women, though?
Until, this is the first time, I don't ever remember him giving authorization to a woman to teach.
In fact, he says the exact
The
opposite,
opposite.
as Tertullian pointed out.
Yes.
Very quietly.
Go, yeah. What I didn't include on here is that she actually takes on the attire and hairstyle of a man to do this preaching and teaching. Remind us of, yeah?
Needs must.
All self-interest and transactional.
Yes, say more.
Self-interest and transactional.
Yeah. On whose part? Paul's part or Thecla's part? God's part.
Well, certainly on Paul's part. He's being endowed to some extent in the end.
Exactly. He's got an in now.
Correct.
Over there, Allie.
I think he felt if he couldn't lick them, he would join them.
Absolutely. And the question then becomes, how common were people like Thecla, and how much was Paul and the early church hierarchy invested potentially in licking them in that sense? Not that one. Right?
But also it could seem like, go do this thing that I want, I want the word to be spread, but I don't want to be tied to you.
Exactly.
Yeah,
They never go together.
yeah.
At every public instance where he has an opportunity to defend her, he does it. He literally said to Alexander, a man who is, for all intents and purposes, about to rape Thecla, I don't know her. Yeah.
I had a question about what people like Peter and Silas and all those characters are doing at this time. Are they with Paul or?
No,
would they
not
have
in
been
this,
with
then
Paul?
in the sort of chronology of where this story is supposed to fall in the later portion of Paul's missionary work. Yeah.
I also have a question, which is Tertullian, was it Tertullian?
Tertullian.
Said, you don't, and Paul, you didn't even allow them to learn anything.
Let
So is
alone
that
teach.
true? Women weren't even allowed to hear? I mean, did he ever specifically say that? Did Paul ever
There's some
specifically say
stuff
that?
in 1 Timothy that gets very close to that. But one of the things that made early Christianity so powerful is its ability to speak to the minoritized, right? The poor, women, people not in positions of authority, right? So in some ways, Paul kind of counteracts the gospel narrative around that radical inclusion, right? And it's unclear, right? We see women in many of Paul's letters having agency and doing things. The Corinthian women in particular, big fans of prophecy. And what I can tell you is that there's a very clear, concerted narrative to decenter women from the work of the church. Does that mean they were not a part of the early church? No, certainly not. And one of the things we need to think about is the arbitrariness of the records that we have, right? We often think of archives as being value-neutral entities, but they're not. They're the product of what people deemed was important to save, or what they were paid to save, or the narrative that they want to put out there, right? What the manuscripts that we have, Paul and Thecla, we have tons of manuscripts of that. And yet, it's not a part of the canon. Fascinating. So what are we going to take away from this? My colleague at Candler, Susan Hyland, wrote an amazing book called A Modest Apostle, which is about Thecla and the role of gender in the Greco-Roman world and how we can understand Thecla as not necessarily being outside the norm. Maybe Thecla is the kind of person that we are more likely to see in the ancient world. And she says, textual evidence conveys conflicting values, again, regarding women's roles and capacities. But what they do tell us is that women were found in leadership roles and exercised authority in the early church, even while expectations for their modest behavior continued unabated. So it's almost like the price of entering the arena, right? That you are going to be modest and play along with these particular social norms in order to have access to this kind of authority. And I really love the way Susan phrases this, right? The conflict around social norms is the norm. The danger comes when we look at the ancient world and say there is one way of being a woman, or there is one way of being a man, particularly if you take Paul's version of what it means to be a woman. And Susan's argument is that even in the Greco-Roman world, there are arguments around what it means to be a woman. These multiple and conflicting norms for women's virtues and behavior are again found within texts, suggesting that these norms exist within social groups rather than defining boundaries between them. So that this conversation, as robust as a conversation as we're having now about the role of women in the contemporary church, that was happening then. And that the boundaries between different groups were less about who's in and who's out and more around trying to shape this amalgamized understanding of what it meant to be a woman, and especially a woman in the church. Another piece that I just want to throw out before we head out today is that we often think of the domestic sphere, the private sphere, as being a place where that didn't have access to authority. That's not the case. The domestic sphere is a site of incredible power and authority in the ancient world. And I mean that both economically and politically. Transactions happened in the home. Patron-client relationships were adjudicated in the home. And women like Thecla, because we know she was an elite woman, would have had access to some of that economic and political power. And the other thing to name is that Thecla's pursuit of an ascetic, sort of early monastic style life, where she's wandering around, not staying in one place, doesn't necessarily remove her from male authority. We could see that as an escape from the married patriarchal household, but she's still subservient to Paul, right? She still has to travel places where he gives permission to power. And in some ways, a married woman might have more access to political authority than someone like a Thecla who is wandering around on her own. And the key takeaway that I really like about Susan's book is the idea that the virtues that Thecla embodies are applicable to all kinds of Christians in all walks of life, both male and female. So Susan's thesis is that what makes Thecla so inspiring and exciting is that everyone can find themselves in her. And that in some ways, she becomes a more effective, more powerful story of the early church than Paul's. So questions, yeah?
We got to get to church.
We got to get to church. You have no questions. Carry on. Let me know if you have questions later on. We'll talk.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Oh, I love Thecla. By the way, if you aren't on the Foundry website, it has... If you're not on the Foundry website, I have documents, all of these primary sources are on there. So if you want to read the Acts of Paul and Thecla or the Martyrdom or Perpetua, you can do that. Mm-hmm.